Hello, everyone, and welcome to this mini charge episode brought to you by EV Geek Studios. And on this lovely March 25th, 2026, I, Sebastian, have the honor of being your host today. Joel is on a spring break vacation, and so he usually does these mini charge episodes, and he let me know Monday afternoon that he forgot to record one before he left. And so you guys get me today. If you've been shopping for an electric vehicle lately, you probably noticed a massive shift. A few years ago, hitting 200 miles on a single charge was considered pretty good. Today, it seems most EVs are boasting at least 300 miles of range, and if you have less than that, you're pretty much immediately discarded. And just look at the numbers. In 2020, there were exactly 4 EV models in the US that could hit over 300 miles of range on the EPA testing cycle. By the end of 2026, it's expected there will be 60 models available in the US with over 300 miles of range. At this point, 300 miles has officially become the norm. We've seen prices plummet to the point where cars like, the 2026 Nissan Leaf, a car that used to have 100 miles of range, now offers over 300 miles of range for around $30,000. So 300 miles is the baseline. But now we have to ask this question. Is 300 miles enough, or are we marching towards even more? Without further ado, let's plug in and get started. All right, for starters, let's just talk about where did 300 miles come from? Why not 250 or 200 or whatever else? And it really just kind of comes into the history of the car market up to this point. Think about the gas-powered vehicles you've probably had or might have had or have seen before. A full tank of gas in those cars is usually around 300 to 400 miles, and that's kind of the point that a lot of these automakers are engineering their cars to. I have personally owned vehicles, a car that I've owned that had gotten 30 some odd miles to the gallon conveniently also had a 10 or 11 gallon tank. And then my vehicle that I've owned that had got like 18 miles to the gallon conveniently had an almost 30-gallon tank, just to kind of get you in that ballpark of 300 to 400-ish miles. That's where the market has been, and that is ultimately kind of where it seems like our brains have been wired, that full means you can drive 300 miles. And as you'll hear a lot of EV people talk about, and this is overkill in our daily lives. The average American only drives around 30 miles a day. That means if you have a 300-mile EV, you could, in theory, charge, once a week, once every 10 days. But unfortunately, we kind of all know where this is going. That only works for the days you commute. What about those days you want to do a road trip or you need to go longer distance or whatever? And that's where you start to kind of see this 300-mile number maybe fall apart a little bit. When you buy a car with a 300-mile EPA rating, you're not always getting 300 miles. Everyone's heard this at some point, kind of seen stories about it, seen people talk about it. First, there's weather. Cold kills batteries. That's just kind of a statement of fact at this point until technology gets more advanced and more better. New word there. Cold kills batteries, and freezing temperatures are, an EV's kind of nightmare at this point, because now you're not only just losing range due to chemistry differences, you're also losing range because you're using the battery to now heat not only the cabin but also the battery pack. And that, you can see range losses easily in the 30% range on a freezing day, which means your 300-mile range EV is now a 210-mile range EV. And you'll see some cracks form too in the way that the EPA kind of does these range figures in the first place. The EPA testing cycle heavily favors city driving, which leads to EVs that will say they have 300 miles of range until you start doing 75 miles on the highway, and then suddenly that figure falls apart. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit, there's kind of this 80-20 rule that you'll see float around. Most manufacturers recommend you only charge your batteries to 80% for daily use, just to kind of prevent any, try to limit degradation, things like that. And then a lot of people that drive their cars, when their cars get to that 10% or 20% range, they kind of start to get nervous, right? They want to stop then. So if you're only going 80 to 20%, you're only using 60% of that battery. And I know what you're thinking. Well, if I'm going on a trip and I know I'm going on a trip, I'll just charge to 100% the night before. Perfect. That's great. That's exactly what you should do if you own an EV and you go on a road trip. But that also only works for that first leg of your trip. And then you're going to stop to charge if you're going longer than your first, longer than that range figure. And when you stop to charge, you're probably not going to charge past 80% because most EVs on the market today, after 80%, charge much, much slower, and it makes more sense to leave and go somewhere else. On all this to say, when you factor all this in, that 300-mile benchmark starts to feel kind of tight for winter driving or towing or multi-stop road trips, etc. And that kind of brings us to this next question. Is 400 miles the answer? If 300 miles isn't enough, why wouldn't you make 400 miles the standard? Historically, building a 400-mile EV has been incredibly difficult and expensive. Up until recently, the 400-mile club was basically two vehicles, or two kinds of vehicles. You had the cars that were kind of ultra aerodynamic, also luxury sedans like the Lucid Air, which can push actually past 500 miles depending on trim level anyway. And then on the other hand, you had just vehicles that were absolutely massive and therefore could afford to have a gigantic battery pack. So on this kind, we're talking about Silverado EV with the 212 kilowatt hour battery pack, or Cadillac Escalade IQ with that same battery, or the Rivian R1s with the Max pack, which again, all of those are large, heavy vehicles. But we're starting to see a shift where 400 miles seems to kind of be trickling down in price. And automakers are kind of doing this in a really cool way. A lot of automakers, such as BMW, are moving towards a more cell to pack technology. So instead of putting battery cells into these modules and then building out this big pack, they're just doing smaller modules of cells that are kind of disconnected from each other. So you can fit them in more ways. Like BMW's kind of putting these pockets of cells all over the floor of the car instead of having one big integral battery pack, which saves weight and gives you kind of some more energy density and gives you more flexibility in how you do the packaging. And because of this, you're seeing things like the 2027 BMW i3 is going to promise 440 miles of range with an estimated starting price of somewhere between 55 and 60 grand. Which for, those kind of keeping up, those vehicles I was talking about before that had over 400 miles of range are all over 100 grand currently. And so hearing, 55, that's still an expensive car, half the price of kind of the previous 400 mile club. But of course, there's a catch to this, and it has to do with chemistry. So right now, a lot of automakers, in an attempt to make EVs affordable, they're pushing pretty heavily into what is called an LFP battery pack. So LFP is lithium iron phosphate. They're cheaper to manufacture. They're very durable. They don't have near as much, like you can charge them to 100% every day. They don't degrade near as bad, etc. They do have poor cold weather performance, and they're just not as energy dense as the more traditional EV battery chemistries. But at the flip side, they're much cheaper to produce. And because of this, we're kind of starting to see maybe a divide in how the EV market goes. I expect we will see on the lower end, a lot of these budget-friendly cars are going to use LFP battery packs, and they're probably going to max out around that 300-mile mark just because of the energy density difference. But then on the high end, probably see, the premium vehicles using the advanced chemistries. Or who knows, maybe one day someone will make an actual solid-state battery, and they'll have over 400 miles of range or whatever else. And so that kind of leads us into the what-if-isms. If the technology is getting there, will everyone eventually end up in a 400-mile EV? Rationally, we probably shouldn't. Pushing for more range right now means bigger batteries, higher costs, and just other compromises. With a bigger battery, you're going to have longer charging times. You're going to have less efficiency due to hauling the extra battery and that extra weight around, and just etc. You might have higher tire wear because your car is heavier, etc., etc. If we have reliable high-speed EV charging everywhere, and then cars that can accept the ultra-fast charges, so 300 miles of range should be, in that case, enough. We're seeing fast charging tech that can get the cars from 10 to 80%, nearly 15 minutes. Think about Hyundai and Kia with their EGMP cars. We're seeing these like the BMW i3 you mentioned before, the bigger battery pack, 400 miles of range, and they're just quoting 10 to 80 in the low 20-minute range. etc. And I mean, we're seeing even faster than that if you're outside of the US, but that's a topic for another day on why we don't get anything cool here. But if plugging an EV in becomes as fast and reliable as pumping gas, the need for that huge battery buffer kind of vanishes. But here's the final thing that hasn't been taken account yet, and that's just human nature. Car buyers as a whole typically don't buy things for the day-to-day. They buy things for the what if. That's why you see highways packed with Tahoes, Suburbans, massive full-size pickup trucks, etc., and there's one person in them. Because they buy the car for the one time they take a family road trip and they haul their in-laws in the back seat, or the one time they take the boat out to the lake, or the possibility that they might buy a boat in the coming years. Then they feel like they need to buy that giant truck or the giant Tahoe, Suburban, whatever, or even the Kia EV9 or whatever else. And that appetite for excess applies to EV range too. Even if 300 miles and that 10-minute charge is all you need, for a couple $1,000s more, you can get into a car with 400 miles of range. Most people would probably take that bet, and that's why I don't think the 400-mile EV is going anywhere. I think we're going to continue to find ways to bring costs down and probably stay close to that 300-mile range and doing all cool sorts of fun, cool stuff, energy density and cell chemistries. But I also think we're still going to see manufacturers trying to find ways to squeeze as much range and efficiency and battery capacity into these packs as they can. So to wrap things up, 300 miles seems pretty solidly like it's the new normal. And it's a pretty incredible technological achievement. Like I mentioned, a mere 5-6 years ago, there were only 4 cars available in the US market with that much range. And now there's going to be almost 60 by the time 2026 is over. That is just crazy to think how far we've come in such a short amount of time. And even before that, and if you look before 2020, it wasn't too far before that was like the only car was what? The Model S? Everything else was in the 1 to 200 mile range. And then you had things like the Leaf with 80 miles and things like that. This is remarkable how quickly we've gotten to the point that 300 miles is the baseline. And for 90% of people, that's probably all they need. But for as long as Americans buy cars for their what-if situations and their wildest fantasies, automakers are going to continue pushing those limits because they can, and it makes them more money. So I expect the sweet spot for the next few years is going to sit somewhere between 300 and 400 miles. And it's just going to kind of be a balance of affordability and chemistry and kind of trying to tackle that lingering range anxiety. What do you think? Are you completely satisfied with a 300-mile EV, or are you holding out for 400 miles before you make the switch? Let me know down below in the comments because I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. All right, that is your mini charge episode for today. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube. And if you're listening to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might get your audio fix from, tap a follow button on there, leave us a rating, a like, a comment, whatever your platform uses. It really helps us grow. So long, everyone, and we will see you on the next mini charge episode.